In Genoa City, the most dangerous wars are never declared out loud. They are built in silence, in careful decisions made behind closed doors, in glances that linger just a second too long before turning away. By the time anyone realizes a line has been crossed, the consequences are already in motion, and the damage is no longer something that can be contained. Sally did not understand that at first. What she felt was unease, a quiet discomfort that something in her world had shifted without her consent. It began with small things, almost too insignificant to name, but persistent enough to refuse to be ignored. There was a discrepancy in the numbers she reviewed, subtle but undeniable. A report that did not align with her own records. A signature that appeared where it should not have been. A delay that felt intentional rather than accidental. At first, she tried to rationalize it, to believe that this was simply the cost of operating in a space where pressure and competition distorted everything. But the deeper she looked, the clearer it became that this was not chaos. It was design. Someone had begun to rewrite her position within the system, placing her at the center of something she did not control. The realization came not as a sudden shock, but as a slow tightening around her, a sense that every step she took was being anticipated, redirected, and ultimately used against her. The evidence was too precise, too consistent across multiple points to be random. Her name was embedded in decisions she did not make, tied to outcomes she did not authorize. Whoever was behind it was not just trying to damage her reputation. They were constructing a version of reality in which she would be the only plausible culprit when everything collapsed. That was the moment Sally understood she was being positioned as a sacrifice. The instinct to fight back was immediate, but so was the recognition that she did not yet understand the full scope of what she was facing. Acting too soon would only accelerate her downfall. She needed clarity, and that need drove her toward Audra, not because she trusted her, but because Audra understood how power actually worked in Genoa City. Audra did not pretend to be moral. She did not hide behind illusions of fairness. She saw systems for what they were and knew how to exploit them. When Sally laid out what she had found, Audra did not react with surprise. She reacted with interest. The pattern was clear to her almost immediately. This was not a spontaneous attack. It was a long-form strategy, one designed to unfold in stages, each step reinforcing the last until the final outcome became unavoidable. And the outcome was simple. Sally would fall, and no one would question it. But as Audra followed the threads, she discovered something that shifted her perspective. The inconsistencies did not exist in isolation. They intersected with decisions tied to the Abbott family, with internal dynamics that had been unstable long before Sally became involved. This was not just about removing Sally. It was about controlling the direction of something much larger. The names Claire and Kyle surfaced not as architects, but as participants in a structure they did not fully understand. Their involvement was indirect, layered beneath other decisions, but present enough to raise questions that could not be dismissed. For Sally, this was the first true fracture in her understanding of the situation. It was no longer about an external enemy. It was about people within the same orbit, people she had not expected to be connected to something this calculated. Claire's position was the most complex. She had seen enough to know that something was wrong, that actions were being taken that would inevitably hurt someone. But she chose silence. Not out of indifference, but out of fear. She believed that exposing the truth too soon would trigger consequences she could not control, that it would destroy something she was trying to protect. So she waited, convincing herself that she could navigate the situation without letting it spiral. That belief became her greatest mistake. Kyle, meanwhile, remained anchored in a different kind of blindness. His trust in the structure around him, in the family that had shaped him, made it difficult for him to see manipulation when it came from within. He sensed tension. He noticed the subtle shifts, but he interpreted them as temporary conflicts rather than signs of a deeper strategy. By the time doubt began to take hold, he was already part of the mechanism that was driving everything forward. At the center of it all was Diane. Her presence was not obvious. It did not announce itself in direct action or visible control. It existed in the connections between decisions, in the way outcomes aligned too perfectly to be coincidental. Diane did not create chaos. She shaped it. She identified vulnerabilities and built around them, guiding events in a direction that served her vision of what the Abbott family needed to become. Her motivation was not simple. It was not about power in the traditional sense. It was about preservation, about control over a future she believed was at risk. She saw threats where others saw uncertainty, and instead of confronting them openly, she chose to eliminate them quietly. Sally became a necessary casualty in that process, not because she was weak, but because she was positioned in exactly the right place to absorb the impact of a controlled collapse. Audra recognized Diane's influence, but instead of stepping back, she leaned in. This was not a situation to escape. It was a situation to exploit. If Diane could manipulate the board, then there was an opportunity to disrupt that control and claim power in the aftermath. Helping Sally was no longer just about strategy. It was about positioning herself within a conflict that could redefine everything. But the deeper Audra moved into the situation, the more she realized that she was not operating outside of it. She was being drawn into the same web, her actions anticipated, her moves accounted for. The illusion of control began to crack, replaced by the unsettling understanding that she was reacting as much as she was acting. Sally reached a breaking point not when she understood the plan, but when she accepted what it meant. There was no path that allowed her to quietly clear her name and move on. The structure had been designed to ensure that any attempt to defend herself would only reinforce the narrative being built against her. The only option left was exposure, not partial, not controlled, but complete. The decision to reveal everything was not made lightly. It carried the certainty that it would not just damage those responsible, but also destroy whatever stability remained. But for Sally, that no longer mattered. Survival was no longer about preserving her position. It was about refusing to be erased. The moment of confrontation did not explode into chaos. It unfolded with a kind of suffocating inevitability. The evidence did not point in a single direction. It revealed connections, decisions, and silences that forced everyone present to confront their own role in what had happened. Diane's influence became impossible to deny. Claire's silence transformed into something far more damning than direct action. Kyle's realization came too late to prevent the damage. What followed was not a dramatic collapse, but a fracture that spread through every relationship in the room. Trust did not break all at once. It dissolved, piece by piece, leaving behind something unrecognizable. The family structure that had once seemed unshakable revealed itself to be fragile, dependent on illusions that could not survive the truth. Sally stood at the center of that fracture, no longer the victim that had been chosen, but not untouched by what she had set in motion. She had exposed the truth, but in doing so, she had also ensured that nothing would return to what it was. Audra watched the outcome with a growing awareness that even calculated risks carried consequences that could not be fully controlled. Diane faced the unraveling of her plan not as a failure, but as the inevitable cost of believing she could shape the future without resistance. And in the silence that followed, one reality became impossible to ignore. This was never just about a single act of betrayal. It was about a system built on control, on secrecy, on the belief that outcomes could be managed without consequence. That system had turned inward, consuming the very people it was meant to protect. The war was no longer hidden. It had surfaced, fully exposed, with no clear resolution in sight. And for the Abbott family, survival was no longer guaranteed. It had become a question, one that would be answered not by strategy or power, but by what remained after everything else had been stripped away.